Scare. Story 1.
The Hitchhiker, a man moved to a small town and slowly got to know a few of his new neighbors. He soon learned that most of the residents believe that one of the roads out of town was haunted. But he didn't believe in ghosts, so he never asked why. One day, the man went to visit a friend in another town. He was enjoying his visit so much that he ended up staying later than he had planned. By the time he left for home, it was way past midnight. There was no moon that night, and once he left the town limits, the only lighting came from his headlights. Soon it began raining, and the rain made it even more difficult to see as a result. It was almost too late to brake when the man saw the woman on the road. He jammed his foot hard to the floor, and the car swerved in the road before coming to a stop just inches from her legs. Normally, the man would have driven off again, but it was so late, and the weather was terrible. He decided to offer the woman a ride. She got into his car, took off her wet hoodie and held her hands up to the vents to capture the warmth. When they reached town, the woman directed him to her home, thanked him for the ride, and went inside. When the man got home, he discovered she had left her hoodie in his car. He thought about driving back to her house, but it was so late that he decided to go inside to bed and return the hoodie the next day. The next morning, he drove back to the house where he had dropped her off, walked to the door, and rang the bell. An older woman answered the door, and he handed her the hoodie. "I gave your daughter a ride home last night, and she left this in my car," he said. The woman began to cry. "My daughter was killed by a hit-and-run driver many years ago," she said. "It happened on the road into town, and she was wearing a hoodie just like this one."
Story 2.
Hide and seek. Two sisters were spending the summer at their grandparents' house. When the sun was shining, they had plenty of fun, swimming in the lake out front, exploring the woods out back, and playing all sorts of games in the gardens. However, one week, toward the end of their stay, it did nothing but rain. The girls had played board games, read books, made things with their craft supplies, and now they were bored. The grandparents' house was large, and the girls thought it would be an excellent place for a game of hide and seek. The younger sister wanted to hide first. She ran off to find a hiding place, while her sister covered her eyes and began to count to 50. The older sister heard her siblings' footsteps running up the stairs and along the hallway to the back of the house. After reaching 50, she opened her eyes and went in search of her sister. The girl went into every room. She looked under the beds and in the closets, behind the curtains and behind the doors, but her sister was nowhere to be found. Finally, she reached the only room their grandparents had told them never to enter. She reached out and grasped the doorknob, turning it slowly and pushing the door open. Much to her surprise, the room was almost empty. The only item was an old, tall, carved wooden cupboard, covered in cobwebs, but the door was slightly open. The girl ran over, laughing, and swung the door open, expecting to find her sister, but the cupboard was empty. She leaned in, and as she did, a cold, icy hand reached out from the back of the dark cupboard and grabbed her wrist. She let out a scream and tried to escape, but the hand started to pull her into the cupboard. The girl's sister heard her screams and ran to find out what was happening. She entered the room and looked on in horror as her sister began to disappear into the cupboard. Luckily, the little sister was quick thinking. She ran toward the cupboard and grabbed her sister's legs. After a brief tug of war, she managed to pull her sister out of the cupboard, and the two girls ran from the room, slamming the door behind them.
Subscribe before it's too late, and maybe, just maybe, you'll escape the impending doom that awaits those who don't. Your fate lies in the subscribe button.
Story 3.
Daddy's home. A man and his young teenage son lived together in a small house on the outskirts of town. The lot their house sat on was large and overgrown, with tall hedges blocking the house from the street. One day, the man left on an overnight business trip, but took his son's phone charger by mistake. As a result, neither the boy nor his father could charge their phones. Both phones were fully charged at first, but the man was delayed on his way home, and by midnight on the second day, both phones were dead. It was just after this that the boy heard a knock on the front door. He was a sensible boy and knew not to open the door to strangers. Instead, he looked out of his bedroom window onto the drive to see who was there. The boy saw his father's car in the drive, but he could not see the front door from his room. He went downstairs and looked through the peephole in the door to see who was there. He could see his father on the other side of the door, looking back at him. And the boy reached up to open the door, but something stopped him. "Dad," the boy called out. "Why are you knocking on the door? Did you forget your keys?" The boy waited, but there was no reply, just another knock on the door. "Dad," the boy called out again. "Why don't you just open the door and come in?" But again, there was no reply. Instead, there was just a steady, rhythmic knocking on the door, which began to get faster and faster. The boy's dad was knocking constantly on the door, waiting for him to open up, when suddenly he stopped, and there was no sound at all. The boy looked through the peephole again. His dad was still there, so he decided to open up. When he opened the door, he discovered his dad's head taped to the door, in front of the peephole, and a trail of bloody footprints leading down the drive.